quick walkthrough on absolute positioning. So right now we're doing a project where we're imitating a print layout, and I pulled up a typical top of a Newsweek magazine. And we've got a couple things here that look like they might need a absolute positioning solution. So the Kissinger on the risks of military AI here, you'll notice that the descenders, the G and the Y, come actually over the red of the next element, and that kind of breaks the normal layout rules. So normally if you've got one block on top of another, it's going to leave space for those descenders. And then the date line lines up right in front of the K, and that is not really typical of what we want. So these both are candidates for absolute positioning because anytime we need to make the rectangles overlap, absolute positioning seems like a good solution. That said, I'm going to suggest that for the top one, we can actually use non-absolute positioning solutions because really that's just centered and then reduced a certain amount. What we would like to know is where is the baseline of that font. So can we get a measurement of that line? There may be a way. I don't actually know a technique for that, so we're just going to experimentally use a margin instead. So what we can do is look at, in this case I've got my H2, which is that heading. I've already wiped out the default margins just as a general matter. I always start with a reset to get rid of paragraph H1 and H2 margin. I'm going to move that rule up top so that it doesn't supersede any other rules I make. So the first thing, let me just center this because it should be centered. That's really simple. And then we could use either position relative or margin bottom, and they're kind of the same idea. So position relative would let us position an item relative to its current position. So I'll show you how that would work. If I said position relative and then I said bottom negative 10 pixels, it's just going to move it down 10 pixels from where it would naturally be. And I can just scooch that up until in practice I get what I want, which is a perfect line. So it looks like 8 pixels is about right. So that's a very simple way to do the layout. I just say position relative, and then I can basically just move it relative to where it would otherwise be. That seems like a pretty straightforward solution here. I'm moving the whole element down. Slightly different, but similar would be if I gave it a bottom margin of negative 8 pixels. And that does the same thing. So that's really two ways to think about it. Margin bottom you can make negative and it will suck up that space, or position relative. There's no reason to use absolute positioning. And it's kind of a bad idea too because we want this to be centered, and the normal browser algorithms can center it and lay it out properly. All we really want to do is scooch it down. So that's kind of a warning about when not to use absolute positioning. Now this date, on the other hand, we want to position inside of Newsweek. And what a beginning student might do would be just to put position absolute on the paragraph. And the minute you do that, I'm going to make it yellow so that we can see it. We can now move it around with a top and left value. And so you might just like play with those values until you got it right. But that's actually very much the wrong solution. So even though you could just move this thing over like that, the way absolute positioning works is it positions it relative to the nearest parent. So in this case, if I shrink this page, you'll notice that that is not moving. So my layout is wrong. So the key concept for absolute positioning is to always pick a relative parent to position the date in terms of. Now in this case, I actually want these letters to line up right against that K. So if I look at the K here, it goes there. So I've got kind of two options. One would be to position this paragraph inside of H1 where it goes. The other way is to literally position it inside the word. I'm going to use the sup tag, which stands for superscript, which is kind of what this is. That would make this maybe not look terrible if there was no CSS, so I'll show you what happens. If I just move that date into a sup tag, there it goes up like that, right? So that's not great. Now, I can get the font size the way I want it. I don't know how big it is, maybe 12 point or something like that. All right, perfect. And this is how it would look with no CSS, so it's not good. Now, in order to use, if I put this in with position absolute, even though it's now inside of the H1 tag, it's still positioned in terms of the overall layout. So what I want to do is I want to make H1 position relative. When I make H1 position relative, the H1 tag becomes the reference point. So for example, if H1 was the reference point and I put this at right 0, top 0, it goes to the top of H1. Now, actually, it wasn't H1 that I really wanted to be the reference point. It was these E's. So I'm going to go ahead and actually add a span around the sup tag. I have to be careful not to add any white space here because I want Newsweek to still be steady. Oops, I already had I had a rule making spans small. I'll have to fix that. I'll make that into a TM rule. There we go. That was for the registered trademark. All right. So now I can make this span class equals rel, and I'll just make a rule here that says rel position relative. Aha! Now this is being positioned in terms of the span that ends at EE. So it shows up perfectly on the right no matter where that goes. And now I can just scooch it down from the top as much as I need to. So I can play with that. 11. Until it looks just like I want it to. And it may be that I wanted it over a little bit, so maybe I do like. Cool. And what's nice about doing this in terms of that span is that let's say that later I change this to a responsive design and for some reason I wanted, for example, the Newsweek to move over to the right. My whole layout still works. So because I absolute positioned in terms of the closest thing, wherever that Newsweek goes, that dateline also goes. So that is why it's important when you do absolute positioning to pick kind of the nearest reference point to position something in terms of. So rather than positioning this date in terms of the whole page or in terms of even this whole heading block, I'm just going to position it in terms of this little span with the two E's on it, and I'm going to put it at the right of that span so that it goes right up against the K.